coming to the end of dear old Brother Job. He has come face to face with God. Well, face to whirlwind. And has heard his voice and has seen the reality of God. Start in chapter 42 and verse 1. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. He now recognized who God was. Instead of just hearing about him, he was able to see him. And that made a big difference. Some of that is, have you ever been around somebody that was really, really, really good? You knew it. There was just something about it. Well, that's what happened to Job by actually being in God's presence. He now recognized that nothing of his could be thwarted, that his purposes would be taken care of. He finally saw the glory of God. When we went through everything that Job and his friends said about God, you heard a lot about the power, but you didn't hear that much about the goodness, the pureness, the perfectness of God. That's why he said, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. That's what he did not know. He knew God's power. He knew what God said. He had heard all of that. But somewhere along the way, the translation got mixed up, and he missed how wonderful God was. He didn't see how great God was. I think we do that too sometimes. We take for granted all the things of this world, and yet they are so complicated. Why water behaves the way it does, why things happen, it's just, and the thing is that our life on this planet could not have existed, even scientists say, had not everything been perfect at exactly the right time. Everything had to fit. Job could tell how wonderful God was. Now, you would have hoped that he would have known that before, but we may not get a vision from God, but we need to take the words of the book and have them come alive. We need to be able to, through the things that God has told us, to see him, to understand about him, to get that picture. Job, being in the patriarchal age and not a Jew, his knowledge of God was not as pure as what we get from the Word of God. He had to sift out about God. And he did a good job, but not perfect. But do you remember in the beginning, we see Job sitting in the ash heap, scraping sores. And he probably continues to do that throughout the whole story. Just think. He started out right where God wanted him, but he slowly drifted away because he lost faith in God's goodness. He had a little bit of what his friends had, which was, God is great, not God is good. The God of heaven's greatness comes from his goodness, from his purity. God does things because they're right. He doesn't make things right because he says so. That's unfortunately where Job's friends were, and where Job was struggling with was that picture of, well, God is God, and he's got the power, and so whatever he does is right, and he can make right whatever he wants. So don't argue, don't. That was where Job started on that bad path, and that's where his friends were, was instead of looking and seeing the goodness of God and that God's decisions were right because they were right. That's who he was right and good and perfectness. His friends had preached the doctrine of a doctrine that's preached today in some denominations called the sovereignty of God. God can do whatever he wants and will do whatever he wants, and whatever he wants is the way it's going to be. Which was basically what they said to Job. This is happening to you. That means you did something wrong. We don't have to know what it is. You don't have to know what it is. If God said you did something wrong, you did something wrong. Instead of, wrong is wrong. And God won't say you did something wrong unless you did something wrong. That's where we really have to fight today is to stop that attitude of God does things and you just have to accept it. No, what God does is right and it's good. And when it doesn't seem to be good and right, it's because we don't see the whole picture. Some things are too wonderful for us to know. That's what Job has come to understand, is that I don't have to understand everything. I don't have to. What I have to understand is God is not only all powerful, but all good. And so I can trust what he does. But now he repents literally in dust and ashes, because that's where he has been. He repents not of sins that caused his problem, but of doubting God, of not trusting God. Because that's where he started out. It was, the Lord willed it, it's okay, it'll be all right. But we like to put a time limit on God for when he reveals his reasoning. You know, we can put up with things being bad for a week or two, but most of us have a limit. There's a time when we say, God, this should have been taken care of. I'm tired of this. And that's what happened to poor Job. This went on longer than he thought it should. He thought it should get cleared up. He didn't understand that it wasn't about what he did wrong. Now here comes the funny part. A couple of funny parts to me. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves, and my servant Job shall pray for you. For I will accept his prayer not to deal with you according to your folly. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. As the kids would say today, burn. That's a burn. You have been wagging your finger at Job and saying how bad he is and how foolish he is, and you're the ones with the folly. Job kept stating, I have not done anything to deserve this. I have kept my covenant with God. And they said, surely you haven't. Job's problem was he thought God was punishing him, and that was unjust. That's what he said. I shouldn't be punished. Well, he was right, but he wasn't being punished. That's where his problem was, is he didn't understand. He didn't see it. But In every speech of Job, you see a feeling of honoring God. Even at his worst, he always goes back to saying, you have the power. You are God. But he says, I think you made a mistake. I think you made a mistake. You shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't be punished. Well, he shouldn't be. He wasn't. He was mistaken in what was happening. But he always felt that if he could talk to God, things would be all right. That he had a trust in God. It's just he couldn't figure out what was going on. But these guys, they were, no, you did something. They did not understand God. So now they have to have Job pray for them. Now things are going to get better for Job. But remember, he's still there sitting on the ground with swords. And so, go take 7 bulls and 7 rams. Go home, get your 7 bulls and your 7 rams, and come back, and my servant Job will pray for you. That had to hurt. So Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did what the Lord had told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. Here are people that have been wrong every step of the way, and God still accepted Job's prayer for them. To me, that's a big weight off my shoulders. Most of us are never going to be as wrong as these guys were. And yet, God took care of it. They got forgiven. Now, to me, the funniest part, and I've got to be real about this, the absolute funniest part, because I started doing these lessons on Job when I was a young preacher. I was probably 26 or 27. And I did it because we got a very modern translation. We had bought some things from World Bible School to send out, and we had bought a bunch of books of Job in a modern translation that you could understand, little paperbacks. And I said, well, why don't we just do that on Sunday night and go through the book of Job? That was something we could do. But you notice there's a character in this book that is missing now. The young preacher. He's not mentioned. I just got such a kick out of that because one of the things that you have to really fight as a young preacher is thinking you know it all. You know, you've just gone to school. You know all this stuff. You've been taught how to do everything. And this was really a way of God telling me you've got to take yourself a little less seriously. God didn't think the young preacher was even worth mentioning. You know, I just, go sit down, you'll grow up someday. I got a kick out of that. You know, and that's the thing is that There are some people who by age should have known better. Job's 3 friends. Elihu, God basically said, you know, you're still growing. You don't know. So we're going to let you take this as a learning experience. One thing that I think we can take from the book of Job is we as human beings do not have the ability, unless God tells us that something is a punishment. I don't know how many times I've seen people say, well, that disaster, that comes because they were so sinful. Maybe. Maybe not. That was where Job's friends got in a bind, was deciding what God did for punishment or not. Thinking they were wise enough to know that the reasons that things happen. We don't know. Was AIDS caused by sinful actions? No. You don't usually get it unless you're doing something you ought not to be doing. However, we don't know that God sent that as a curse for that. We just know it happened. Now we can say, you know, common sense tells you if you do something and it's not good for you, you ought not to do it. Common sense should tell us, you know, that God has never made a rule for us that was not for our good. There's a lot of things that He has said that we don't necessarily like. But the fact is that in the end, when you turn the tapestry over, everything He has told us is for our good. And that things would always work out better for us if we did what He told us to do. That's something we need to understand, and we need to learn from Job that, you know what? Sometimes a natural disaster is just a natural disaster. Or sometimes it's God's way of accomplishing something greater. I will tell you that God can take things that seem so terrible and make them into blessings. There are Christians throughout Southeast Asia because young Christian men were over there. Why did God allow all of that? Don't know. But we do know that regardless of why things happen, God manipulates them for good. God has always taken and gotten some good out of the bad things that happen from giving man free will. If you ever want to know why there is evil and bad things in the world, there's a Satan. That's the lesson of Job. There's a Satan that's doing his best to make things bad. But the second is, God gave us free will to choose to follow Satan or God. The bad things that happen in this world are not God's fault. They're Satan and our fault. That's why bad things happen, because human beings listen to Satan, not to God. But just as with Job, the worst of things have a silver lining, and we'll finish up next Sunday night. If anybody needs to answer the invitation in a public way, we could ask that you stand now as we sing.
Kneel at the cross, Christ will meet you there. He intercedes for you. Lift up your voice, leave with him your care, and begin life anew. Kneel at the cross.